Hope's Ember by Tucker Waters. Prologue. The stars shone with the strength of a young knight, casting a soft glow over the beach below. 4 fully armed knights in black stood surrounding a large metal object, almost indistinguishable in the thick darkness, just beyond the reach of the incoming tide. "I still don't get why we have to guard this thing," said the shortest of the knights, turning towards one of his companions as he spoke. "Nobody could get away on it," he continued. "Need I remind you that Lord Vernon, supreme ruler over Erion, is the most brilliant military mind of our time? He must have a good reason," the other knight replied, with a scathing look of disapproval. "Even if it somehow got down to the water, it wouldn't float. It would sink straight to the bottom," the shorter man retorted. "Are you questioning the word of your superior officer?" "I agree with Gareth," another knight put in. "I mean, look at it," he continued, pointing at the craft. The 3 men's voices rose as they continued disputing. They were so engrossed in their argument that they didn't even notice when the 4th of their companions collapsed to the ground unconscious. A rock having struck the man in the temple, 3 figures crept towards the remaining guards as quiet as shadows. Thump! Gareth crumbled to the ground. "What?" the officer exclaimed, but it was too late. In a flash, he felt a strong arm clasp his throat. "We don't want to hurt you," a man's voice said. "We know you're just following orders." With that, he felt a tremendous blow to the head, and the world went fuzzy and then pitch black. His 3rd companion had suffered a similar fate. A boy standing over him with a wooden club grasped firmly in both hands. "We better tie him up." "Good idea, Jerome," the other man replied, producing a coil of rope from a pocket inside a dark cloak he was wearing. The 3 raiders tied the knights up and dragged them into a cave on the beach where they could not be easily seen. "You ready, Dad?" the boy asked. "Let's go, Truman," he responded, heading toward the beached submarine. Together, they pushed it into the water, waiting until the water lapped at their ankles before opening the entrance hatch and climbing in. Chapter 1. Inside the submarine, the 3 companions settled into a tense silence as they sank below the surface. 2 days after the self-proclaimed Lord Vernon's takeover, Jerome, Kilgore, Truman, and his dad had all met in a secret meeting with Megan. Their plan was to reunite the islands that had all been part of Erion during King Xavier's rule. They were currently headed for the island known as Calderonia. Kilgore, who had lived on Calderonia since the first confrontation with Lord Vernon, relayed the name of a rebellion on that island. They were called the Guardians of the Whirlpool. Their leader, William Dunningham, had pledged his support should the time arise. "We should be reaching the island soon. We're going to have to risk going up," John Maxwell said, jolting Truman out of his thoughts. "You sure it's time?" Jerome asked quizzically. "Only one way to find out," Truman's dad replied, beginning to steer the craft toward the surface. "What about the guard boats?" Truman asked. "They're sure to be looking for us," Mr. Maxwell said, a little bit irritably. Truman and Jerome looked at each other and shrugged. It looked like they were headed up anyway. The sub rose, clearing the waves and sending a soft trickle of ocean spray down its sleek sides. They could see the island about 50 yards away. Reaching up above his head, Mr. Maxwell pulled a bright yellow lever, causing a compartment to open up below their feet. Inside, there was a large inflatable lifeboat. "It will be tight, but I think it'll work." "What made you think of that?" Truman asked in wonder. "Whenever you're on a dive, you don't know for sure if you're going to have to surface early as a last resort. It never hurts to be too prepared," Truman's dad replied with a small smile. The 3 of them pulled the orange lifeboat out of the now floating sub. The makeshift craft bobbed up and down on the surface of the water as they climbed in. John Maxwell and Jerome each took a paddle, beginning to guide them closer to the shore. They were far enough away from Lord Vernon's lookouts that the submarine would likely go unnoticed, being so low to the surface of the water. Tara stood atop the cliffside, her keen eyes scanning the beach below. This was the perfect place for a lookout. She was positioned behind a rock outcropping where she could observe things without being seen. There had been rumors of a great battle taking place on the main island of the Old Kingdom. All sentries had been stationed at lookout posts with the hope of avoiding being surprised by this mysterious threat. Tara didn't understand it at all, but she enjoyed nights like this that caused the adrenaline of unknown danger to course through her. However, tonight seemed very quiet. Nothing out of the ordinary was happening. Just my luck, she thought. I get called out on lookout duty and nothing's going on. As if in answer to her thoughts, a dark shape rose out of the water. 3 figures got out of a strange craft, pulling a brightly colored boat after them, before getting in it and rowing toward the beach. Once there, the strangers pulled their craft up the sand, covering it in some shrubbery that they found nearby. The 3 forms began making their way quietly in her direction. Tara drew an arrow from her quiver, nocked it, and positioned herself behind a particularly large boulder. She stood still as the 3 newcomers made their way up the cliffside. "Hey, look!" one of them said, pointing at a partially concealed dirt path that wound its way up the cliffside. Why didn't I cover that more? Tara thought, annoyed at herself. "Confounded stone!" one of the 3 men tripped, exclaiming in anger as he regained his feet. "Shh!" one of them said in response. "We don't want to scare anyone. They don't know who we are yet." This voice was younger than the other men, possibly closer to her age. "You okay?" the 3rd man asked. "I'll live. If they don't make rocks around here sharp, I don't know what," the older man replied. The group was almost to her now. Their boots could be heard crunching on the rocky path. "Hold it!" Tara said, stepping out from where she'd been hiding, bow drawn. "Why, of all the dirty tricks!" the oldest of the 3 exclaimed. "Easy, Jerome," the youngest said, fixing Tara with a calm and collected gaze. Not the kind of behavior you'd expect to see from an enemy, Tara thought. "Why are you here?" she asked. "We're on your side. Have you heard about what happened on the main island?" It was a gamble, and Truman knew it. "Sort of. We heard there was a battle." Her father had gone there. "I wonder if these people know if he's okay," she thought. "Your island is in danger." "I'm guessing you lost?" she asked. "Yes, but we're here on a mission. We need your help." "How do I know we're on the same side?" she questioned, bows still raised. "Do you know Kelgor?" the boy questioned, his eyes searching for a reaction. "Maybe," she replied. "What is your name?" the boy asked. "Tara," she responded, uncertain. "I'm Truman." There was something in the boy's green-blue eyes that depicted honesty. Tara lowered her bow. "Kelgor's my father," she said, relenting. "Pleasure to meet you," Truman replied. "I'm glad to know we are on the same side." "You had me for a minute there," he continued, smiling. "John Maxwell," said the man, shaking the young girl's hand. "Jerome?" Truman questioned, noticing the grumpy expression. "Oh, all right. My name's Jerome," he said, addressing Tara. "Your father told us you might know of some allies. A group called the Guardians of the Whirlpool?" Truman questioned. "Yes," Tara said. "They've protected our family through the last few years." "I can get you in contact with their leader," she replied. "First, you need a safe place to stay for now. Come with me." The Guardians of the Whirlpool set up several safe houses for events just like this. The 3 of them followed the girl as she led them through a thick forest. In the early morning light, Truman got a better look at her. She was an elf, he realized, somewhat surprised. She had black hair, a pale white complexion, and honey yellow eyes that sparkled in the early morning light. They traveled in silence, the occasional morning call of birds breaking through the serene atmosphere. The group came to a particularly large tree. Tara went up to it and gave it a light tap. "Who is it?" came a muffled voice from inside the tree, surprising Truman. "It's Tara," she whispered. Abruptly, the midsection of the tree fell away, revealing a small room where an armored figure stood. He was young, but had the look of an experienced warrior. "Hi, Hans," Tara said, addressing the young man. "These people were sent here from Kelgor. They need our help." "Right," Hans replied. "In here," he replied, addressing the group of newcomers. Truman, his dad, and Jerome followed his direction, stepping inside the hollow trunk. Then, the man pulled a lever previously hidden from view. Abruptly, the floor below them began to lower down under the ground, resembling an elevator. Soon, the area around them opened into a vast expanse where much work was being done. Guards stood at intervals along the walls, fully prepared for action. "Right this way," Hans said, pointing down a long corridor. Torches were mounted on the wall, casting their warm glow throughout the corridor. "Our guest quarters are this way," Hans continued. "Our leader will see you shortly." There was enough space for all of them to have their own room. Truman left the group and entered his room. Truman paused, taking in the scene around him. The room was comfortably furnished, for a base, that is. A cot sat on one side of the room, a writing table on the other. A quill sat on the table, its tip resting in an ink basin. A candlestick sat on the other side of the table, its soft glow creating the only source of light in the room. The walls were made up of very thick timber, reinforced by 4 large spruce beams, one in each corner of the room. "It's not much," Hans said, entering the room, "but we have to make do." "I'm just glad to have a place to stay," Truman said. "How long have you guys had this place set up? I mean, you almost have a full-blown army here." "It's taken a long time," Hans said with a smile. "Commander Dunningham has sacrificed so much for the cause of restoring the Old Kingdom." "Do you have contacts on the other islands?" Truman asked. "I'll let the commander explain the details," Hans responded. "For now, get some rest. You've had a long day." With that, he left the room, leaving Truman to settle onto his cot and give in to sleep. Chapter 2. "Truman?" Mr. Maxwell whispered, bringing him out of his slumber. "Yeah, Dad?" Truman replied groggily. "Commander Dunningham is waiting for us in his quarters. It's time." "Right," Truman replied, coming awake. Outside in the hall, Jerome, along with 2 guards, were already waiting for them. "This way," one of the men said, directing them down the corridor. Obviously, the ranking officer from the authoritative tone in his voice. The company headed further down the corridor until they reached a spiral staircase, which they began to climb. At the top, there was a heavy metal door. One of the guards stepped forward, pulling a golden ring of keys from his belt. He selected a key and pressed it deep into the door's large lock. There was the scrape of metal on metal as the key turned. Then the door opened. Inside, a man stood with his back to them, looking down at what appeared to be a map placed on a large wooden table. "Commander Dunningham, sir?" one of the guards said. "The fugitives are here, as you requested." "Very well, Sergeant Reynolds. You 2 may go." The 3 newcomers were left alone with Commander Dunningham. "What's the news from the main island? We've only heard rumors," Commander Dunningham asked with concern evident in his gaze. He was a well-built man with black hair, blue eyes, and a tan face, obviously hardened from years of combat experience. "Prince Vernon has taken over and declared himself Lord Vernon. That's why we're here. The people on the main island are in danger, and before long it will extend to the other islands as well. We escaped with the hope that we had enough time to warn the rest of Erion's people of what was to come. Perhaps together, we can reunite Erion as one people and destroy Prince Vernon once and for all," Truman said. William Dunningham sat back in a wooden rocker studying this boy. "Jerome?" he inquired. "Who is this boy?" "His name is Truman," Jerome replied.
Do you remember the woman who King Xavier was falsely accused of sharing Erion's secrets with? Jerome asked.
Yes, I believe so.
This is her son. And this is her husband, Jerome said, gesturing toward Truman's father.
Pleasure to meet you both, Commander Dunningham replied. I can speak for the rest of the Guardians of the Whirlpool. We are with you, he said. Reuniting Erion is our supreme goal, but not all the people here are with us. I will try to help you gain their support, and together we will succeed. Commander Dunningham then went to each of them, shaking their hands. I trust you have been shown to your quarters, the commander questioned, addressing Jerome.
Yes, sir,
Jerome replied, an uncharacteristic amount of respect in his voice. Truman glanced at his dad, somewhat surprised. Good, Dunningham responded. We will meet for dinner in the Great Hall. Is there anything you need before we go? The commander continued, a question in his eyes.
Food sounds good to me,
Jerome said, unconsciously rubbing his round belly. The other members of the group shared a small grin as they continued making their way down the staircase. At the bottom, they were accompanied by several armed guards. As you can see, this is not a place for luxury, Commander Dunningham said. We are merely here to wait for the day when our mission can be fulfilled. The day is now closer than ever, Dunningham said, looking Truman straight in the eye. The company headed back across the long corridor that they had passed through earlier, until they reached yet another staircase. This one led down, leading them still deeper into the base. Truman gathered that this base was simply a vast series of tunnels which could allow you to disappear very easily. This would make it very difficult for an enemy to take over the entire base. I see you are admiring our design, Commander Dunningham said, breaking into Truman's thoughts. Oh, yes, sir. I was thinking how easy it would be to hold up here. Commander Dunningham nodded. Your friend Kilgore had a hand in that. Him and I were both commanders in King Xavier's army. After his death, we chose different lives. However, he did recognize the need for a well-designed base. The group reached what appeared to be a dead end with a stone wall staring blankly at them. What now? Truman asked. Just watch, Commander Dunningham replied, smiling slyly. One of the guards that was walking with them stepped forward, pressing his hand into the wall on Truman's left. A segment beneath the man's hand recessed deeper into the wall's stony surface. Instantly, the wall, which had previously stood in their path, began to recede into the ceiling above. The sound of grinding stone could be heard as the giant slab of rock slid away. Truman's jaw dropped in sheer amazement. How did you manage this stuff? He asked the commander. Well, Caldronia is home to Erion's most brilliant smiths. This is where I got trained, Jerome put in, smiling at the memories. The corridor opened up into a large room, as the trapdoor closed behind them. In the middle of the room, there was a large table with a fresh meal already prepared. A variety of foods sat along the table, wafting a delicious aroma. Steam rose off the freshly cooked meat. Light shone from 4 long candlesticks symmetrically arranged in the center of the table. 2 men sat waiting for them as they approached. They appeared to be generals by their medals and garb. These are my generals, Otto Winsworth and Duncan Stanterbury. The men stood to exchange greetings with the new arrivals before settling back into their chairs, where they began to eat. Truman hadn't realized how famished he was until he sunk his teeth into what appeared to be a juicy turkey leg, still warm from being cooked. For a while, everyone's attention was solely directed on devouring all of the delicious food they had been given. So what brings you here? Duncan asked through a mouthful of chicken leg. With that, Truman filled the generals in on their mission. Like Commander Dunningham, the generals expressed complete support for their cause. Once the meal was finished, Dunningham spread a map across the table and directed their attention to it. This is where we are, he said,
pointing to an area on the map with a circle around it. See these hills? He continued, directing their attention to another area on the worn-down parchment.
Yeah, what about it? Truman said, puzzled.
That is the mining country.
This is where the island gets most of its stone and silver for making weapons. The miners will give us the most trouble. The people who live on that section of the island used to make our supplies for this base. Those same people have begun to enjoy not being under King Xavier's rule. They even sympathize with Vernon. When he came here the first time, the people of the mining country were the ones that were most easily swayed. We were able to salvage enough weapons to fully arm the base. However, since then, they have cut off our supply to necessary resources. I am sure that when they hear of Prince Vernon's return, that they will likely mobilize to form an army, which could cause issues, as you well know. Your arrival could not have come at a more interesting time, Commander Dunningham said. We have been planning a raid on their mining camps. There has been the occasional loyalist that has helped us with our plans. If we can neutralize Lord Vernon's influence on the island, then we are one step closer to the ultimate goal of liberating Erion.
So what's your plan?
Jerome asked, addressing the commander. Our problem is, although the terrain of the mining country is perfect for its purpose, it is also perfect for lookouts and archers, meaning that many soldiers would be lost in the fight. We had been hoping to spring the attack from the inside out, only we haven't found the right man to do the job. Many of the miners are dwarfs, Dunningham said, with a significant look at Jerome.
I can see what you're driving at,
Jerome said. They're always looking for someone with experience, Dunningham responded. We need to strike now, General Stantonberry put in. If we don't, Lord Vernon is likely to learn of your arrival on this island, which would jeopardize your mission. Chapter 3.
What would you like me to do?
Jerome asked. We have an idea for how to get you into the mining camp, Dunningham replied. Willie Tanson is the foreman in the camps. He's currently looking for a replacement for one of his top miners who has conveniently gone missing, Commander Dunningham said, exchanging knowing looks with his generals. Under the name of Melvin Newport, you will attempt to gain the trust of Tanson and his colleagues. We will have a scout posted just outside the border between us and the mining camps. You will report everything to him.
Got it, Jerome replied. How do I get this Tanson guy to let me work for him?
Right now, he is holding competitions for miners to show their skill set. If you enter and impress him, you got yourself a job. And we've got ourselves an inside man. Jerome nodded, understanding plain on his face. Are you with us? Otto Winsworth inquired, addressing Jerome.
I'm with you, for Erion and for our people.
Hear, hear, the group exclaimed, their voices ringing out as one.
When do we start?
Jerome asked. First thing in the morning, Dunningham replied. We will need to use the night to make our final preparations. First off, we need to get you some fresh clothes. Even the faintest trace of the ocean could tip them off. They are a very suspicious group of people. Plus, what do you have in the way of weapons? Jerome drew a small sword from beneath his cloak. Its blade seemed to glow orange, reflecting the flickering candlelight. Very nicely made, Dunningham said, admiring the craftsmanship.
I made it myself,
Jerome said, smiling. Do you think you need anything else?
Do you have any mellowberry darts?
Jerome asked. Indeed we do, but our supplies are running low. That's the reason this mission is so vital. However, we could spare a few. I can have one of the men make you a small supply.
That would be wonderful, said Jerome.
Turning toward the rest of the group, Commander Dunningham looked over all of them. While Jerome carries out his mission, I will attempt to help you gain the trust of the people that are most likely to care for the old kingdom and long for its return, Dunningham continued, pointing toward another spot on the map. Here is where we will likely gain the most support. The spot he had indicated was in the middle of the parchment.
I happen to know that there are people in this area who have always supported our cause and have waited for the day when they could rise up for Erion.
Does this place have a name? Truman inquired, gesturing toward the place that Dunningham had highlighted in their conversation.
Yes, the village of Willow Springs. You'll see why when we get there,
Dunningham responded.
For now, you need to get some rest, Jerome. You have some long days ahead of you,
Dunningham continued, turning to speak to the Orf.
Yes, sir,
Jerome replied, the fire of adventure entering the seasoned man's eyes.
Good night, everybody,
he said, turning to leave the room. Commander Dunningham followed him, stopping in the doorway to call over Jerome's shoulder.
Corporal Spruce.
Yes, sir,
a knight replied, turning to address the commander.
Would you prepare a scout-sized pack of melloberry dots? This man is to go on a mission tomorrow.
Right, consider it done,
Spruce responded, saluting his commander before leaving to carry out his duty. Then, to everyone's surprise, Dunningham saluted Jerome as the little man left them for the evening. Chapter 4. The sun rose on a day that would be remembered in Erion for ages. Whether for the victory of good or the triumph of evil, no one knew which. Truman left his room, knowing it might be his last chance to see his friend. Jerome stood in the corridor, wearing a pair of denim overalls with a white and yellow striped shirt underneath it. He even had a matching watch cap similar to the one Truman had seen him wear on the first day they met. Truman crossed over to him. "Good luck," he said, shaking the portly man's hand.
"Well, I guess I'm off now,"
Jerome said, smiling back at the boy.
"We'll see each other again, don't worry,"
Jerome continued, seeming to read Truman's thoughts. John Maxwell crossed the room to join in the farewell. "Pleasure knowing you, Mr. Jerome. My thoughts are with you," he continued. He couldn't understand why. He had only known the man a short time, yet Mr. Maxwell had grown to have respect for this man, similar to how he knew Truman felt. Jerome looked over his group of friends that he had made in such a short time and already was willing to risk his life for. "The lookouts that are loyal to us have been notified of your mission," Dunningham said, coming up to Jerome. "Your main contact will be hiding in the mountains at the very beginning of the mining territory. He will be watching for you, so all you have to do is go near that area and he will meet you. His name is Hugo Woodward. He will ask you if the flame is alive. You will answer that you carry Hope's Ember." At this, the whole group smiled, feeling the strength of those words. "It's time to go, my friend," Dunningham said. Jerome turned, looking over his friends one last time.
"I can see for myself that the flame is alive."
After this, he saluted them all before turning, carrying the embers of the hope of an entire kingdom on his shoulders. Chapter 5. Jerome headed up toward the platform that they had originally entered the base with. A guard who stood by noticed him.
"Commander Dunningham's orders. I need to head up. Can you help me get this newfangled contraption to work?"
The guard gestured for him to step onto the platform, which currently laid flush with the floor. Jerome did so, and the guard stepped over to the wall, feeling with his hand until he found what he was looking for. He pushed on a small segment of the wall. Instantly, a small board above him fell forward, revealing that it was actually a lever. "Are you ready, sir?" the guard asked, speaking to Jerome. Jerome nodded. Then the guard pushed the lever back up into the wall, where it assumed the disguise of a normal board once again. The platform began to rise, bearing Jerome up with it. Soon, Jerome reached the surface, coming up inside the tree trunk they had entered through. Jerome felt in the darkness until he found the outline of a secret door. He ran his hand along it until he was sure, and then pushed it open. Bright sunlight poured through the opening, temporarily blinding him. Jerome stepped out of the opening, turned and closed the door before venturing out into the beautiful forest beyond. Jerome pulled a map from out of his pocket.
"Let's see. So the mining camps are..."
Why don't they make this thing easier to read? Jerome exclaimed in annoyance. I'm sure people will know about this competition, Jerome thought. He headed back in the direction of the path that they had met Tara on. All roads lead to somewhere, Jerome said, grumbling to himself. He followed the dirt path until he saw a collection of cabins that looked like a tiny town. He eagerly covered the rest of the distance to the town. When he arrived, Jerome took in the situation. On one side of the dirt road stood a smith's shop, eerily dormant to a craftsman at heart. On the other side of the road stood a cafe. The Islanders' Getaway was written above the doorway. Jerome crossed to the cafe and went in. The room was comfortably arranged. Wooden tables were set all around. Jerome looked around the room. A poster was nailed to the wall. Willie Tanson, Mining & Co. was written in black lettering across the top of the tan parchment. What's this all about? Jerome asked, gesturing toward the poster. A man stepped out from behind the small counter at the side of the room. Willie Tanson is holding competitions to find the best miner in the territory. It seems one of his best men walked out on him, the man responded. Where you coming from? Can I get anything for you, stranger? Just looking for work. If you have something warm to drink, that'd be nice. The closer I get to those mountains, the colder it's getting. I gotcha. One hot burst snap coming right up. The waiter returned to his original location where he began preparing Jerome's drink. Jerome followed him, resting his elbows on the wooden counter. Where does this competition happen? The Orf asked. The waiter finished preparing the drink before speaking, squeezing an assortment of leaves and berries into a cup, creating what appeared to be a sort of tea. Then he held the beverage next to a furnace that was recessed into the wall. That should get it warm, the man said, handing Jerome the steaming hot beverage. Now, what was it that you were asking me? This mining competition. Where does it happen? Jerome asked again, before taking a long, delicious sip of his drink. I'm afraid you'll have to get colder, the waiter responded. Tanson's mining camps are way up in those mountains you were talking about. You should be able to see them better when you get just outside of town. Once you get to the mountains, just follow the signs. Tanson definitely made sure that people knew that the miners controlled that area. I see, Jerome said. You looking for work up there? The waiter asked. Sure thing, Jerome responded. I figured as much, the waiter said. I could tell you were moving on soon. Man, this stuff is good. I'd sure hate to stop drinking it. What did you say it was called again? It's called Burst-Snap Tea. It will keep you warm while you travel. And it's good for energy too, the man exclaimed. The two men exchanged small talk for a while as Jerome finished his drink. Would it be all right if I got one for the road? Sure thing, the waiter responded, turning to brew up another Burst-Snap. What do I owe you? Jerome asked, reaching into his pocket. Don't worry about it, the waiter answered. The first drink is always on the house, and I'll forget you got one for the road. Thanks. You got a nice place here, Jerome replied. I might come back through. After saying goodbye to the other man, Jerome left the cafe and turned to head out of town. I should have brought a jacket, Jerome thought, shivering slightly as he saw the mountains ahead, their peaks covered with snow. The dirt road slowly became more rocky as Jerome began traveling upward. Crunch! Jerome froze. What was that? He thought. It sounded like footsteps. Jerome tiptoed quietly until he was behind a large boulder that jutted out from the side of the road. He could hear the steps coming closer. Jerome waited patiently, unease rising in his chest. Had the waiter noticed something? Could he have tipped him off? The newcomer crept past the boulder without seeing the Orf. Jerome crept up behind the man. He was armed with a sword ready in hand, but Jerome had the element of surprise. He put his arm around the man's neck, holding him in a headlock. What are you doing here? Jerome asked, whispering into the man's ear. Easy, the man said. I wasn't doing anything. Jerome decided to try him. I just came from town, Jerome said. The man must have understood what he meant with his tone. Is the flame alive? The man questioned. And I carry Hope's Ember, Jerome replied, releasing the man. Hugo Woodward?
Indeed, the man responded, smiling broadly. You must be Jerome. Nice to finally meet you. It's a brave thing you're doing. The commander thought you could use this, Hugo said, handing Jerome a jacket. It was made with some type of brown animal skin with warm white fur lining the inside. Thank goodness, Jerome said, donning the jacket as quickly as he could. That couldn't have come at a better time. I was about to catch frostbite, he continued, reveling in the jacket's warmth. In that case, I'm glad I found you when I did, Hugo responded, chuckling at the Orf's sarcastic remark. The camp's about a mile further into these mountains. You should begin to see the smoke from their fires that are in the middle of the mining compound. How do you know where everything is? Jerome asked. We've had men like you attempt similar missions in the past, acting as scouts for future missions. I see, Jerome said, the understanding plain on his face. Good luck, Hugo said, clasping the other man's hand. May you keep the flame alive. With that, the two allies parted ways. Jerome began his journey up the mountains. Traveling in silence, he set his mind on planning his first moves. First, he would have to pass as Melvin Newport. Jerome couldn't imagine what would happen if Willie Tansen had learned that he wasn't just a simple miner. Next, he would have to win the mining competition. Jerome suddenly doubted that he could win a contest in a field he had no experience in. Above all, he had to gain the trust of the miners. As these thoughts flooded into his mind, Jerome saw smoke in the sky up ahead and knew that he was nearing the camps. Chapter 6. The evening after Jerome's departure, Truman, his dad, Commander Dunningham, and several others of the War Council were sitting in the commander's office. We leave for Willow Springs in the morning. One of our best scouts will travel with us, Commander Dunningham was saying to the group. I believe you may have met her, Dunningham continued, speaking to Truman. Her name is Tara. Being the daughter of Erion's most well-respected general, she will make it easier to gain the people's support, reminding them of the old glory of Erion and the peace that it brought to all of us. Are you sure she truly believes in our cause? General Stantonberry asked from the corner of the room. I don't think she knows, but her heart is true and she is a good person. We can trust her to keep our operations a secret, Dunningham replied. We leave before the sunrise, so as to travel in darkness. With that, the group dispersed to salvage what rest they could and pack for the journey ahead. Truman reached his room, laying down on a cot to think. A long journey was ahead of them. Where was Jerome? Truman hoped he was okay. Truman reached in his pocket and pulled out his jewel. Its blue-green glow was a comfort in these times. He felt a connection to it, as if it could protect him. This was the last thought he had before falling asleep, the jewel watching over him in the night. Truman woke with a start. He could hear the sound of movement out in the hall and knew it was time to go. He walked quietly out of his room, meeting Commander Dunningham. Do you have an extra sword I could use? Truman asked. The only thing I got off the island with was a club. Sure. Do you know how to use it? Dunningham questioned. Yes, I trained under Kelgor. With that, Dunningham left, returning a moment later holding a beautifully crafted sword. Its hilt was laced with black leather to make it easier to grip. This was my grandfather's sword. I can tell you will take good care of it, the commander said, before handing Truman the weapon. It almost felt majestic in Truman's hand. You have my word, sir, Truman responded, dropping to his knees in awe at the honor he had just been given. He then placed his head on the hilt of his new sword in a sign of respect. I promise to use this sword only for Erion and Erion alone. Commander Dunningham took his hand and lifted him up. I am thankful for your loyalty, my friend, even when you didn't have to show that much. For Erion's freedom, Dunningham said. For Erion's freedom, the rest of them echoed, their voices resonating as one. Then Truman, his dad, Dunningham, and Stantonberry set out for Willow Springs. When they reached the forest beyond their base, they traveled in silence toward the road. The darkness was still thick in the early morning, allowing them to travel without being seen. They were passing by a group of boulders at the edge of the cliffside when they heard the snap of a twig. Dunningham signaled for them to stop, looking through the night for the source of the sound. Tara came quietly out from behind the rocks. "It's just me," she said, her hands up in a sign of peace. "Hi, Commander," she said, addressing Dunningham.
"Good to see you, Tara. These are the other members of the group.
"I think you know most of them." Tara nodded, introducing herself to Stanterbury. "Hi, Mr. Maxwell," she said, addressing Truman's father. "Truman, was it?" Truman nodded. "It's nice to see each other without an arrow possibly puncturing my skull at any moment," Truman said, smiling. "I was just being on the safe side," Tara responded, returning the smile. Then the group set out once more as the rays of the early morning sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon. For a while, the group traveled in silence, each one absorbed in their own thoughts regarding the journey ahead. The trail began to slope downward as they continued on. This eventually leveled out into a vast expanse of prairie land. The company walked on.
"See that hill?"
Commander Dunningham said, pointing toward a green slope in the distance. The rising sun made it difficult to make out as they traveled. Truman shaded his eyes. He could just see it on the far-off horizon, its peak blanketed with shadow. "I think I see it," he replied, squinting from the rays of the sun. "Willow Springs is just beyond it," the commander said to the group. The 5 adventurers quickened their pace, eager to reach their destination. They made good time, marching through the grassy plains before cresting the top of the hill Dunningham had indicated. Below them lay a cozy little mountain town, behind which the prairie gave way to beautiful mountain country. They then descended the hill, coming down to a dirt path leading to the village. However, Dunningham led them off the trail leading to still more hills. They continued on until they reached a grouping of 2 hills side by side. Dunningham crossed to one of the hills, gesturing for Stanterbury to go to the other hill. Following the commander's lead, the captain nodded in apparent understanding. Dunningham put 3 fingers up in the air. 3, 2, 1. The 2 men pushed on the front of the hill, acting in unison. A large segment of both hills receded, revealing a secret door in each. One by one, they walked through the newly found door.
"This will lead us through a series of underground passages in order to get us into town undetected,"
the commander said, closing the entrance as he did so. Stanterbury did the same, and together, the group resumed their journey. Soft sunlight leaked through the secret structure, revealing the path ahead. Truman was about to ask how this was possible, when Dunningham explained, seeming to read his thoughts yet again. "The internal structure of the hill that this tunnel begins in has been thinned out ever so slightly to let a little light in. As we get further into town, though, we'll have to resort to torches." "Isn't that slightly dangerous? I mean, couldn't the hill collapse on us?" Truman asked, the concern evident on his face.
"What durability we take away, we replace with wood beams planted deep into the ground. We're safe,"
Dunningham said, reassuring the young boy. "Why are we having to travel secretly again? We're going to our allies, right?" Truman asked. "We want our mission to remain a secret so Lord Vernon does not know of our plan. There's always someone that could give away information for the right price. The less people know, the better." Truman nodded, the path beginning to darken ahead of them. They came upon a large stone that seemed rather out of place, at least to Truman's eye. However, its purpose became clear when Commander Dunningham reached behind it, pulling out a torch. He then struck it hard against the stone, causing sparks to fly. The group moved on, following Commander Dunningham's lead, his torch burning brightly in his hand.
"We should be getting there soon,"
Dunningham said, his voice echoing in the dark chamber. The commander proved his word because in a very short time, the party reached the tunnel's end. Above them, there was a wooden panel partially concealed with dirt. Reaching up, the commander grasped a handle on the wooden hatch, yanking it open. Dunningham gave Tara a boost up. Then Truman followed, his father and Stanterbury close behind. Lastly, John and Stanterbury reached in and hoisted Dunningham up, closing the hatch behind them. They were in what appeared to be a dimly lit cellar full of an assortment of foods and bottles of drinks. Truman's brain swam. They hadn't eaten since they left.
"Let's talk to the people of the house first,"
Dunningham said, noticing their look of hunger. Groaning, the group followed their leader to a set of stairs that led up to the main part of the home.
At the top of these stairs stood a white door, serving as the final barrier between them and the living area. To everyone's surprise, the door opened without resistance. Dunningham walked through. He then gestured to the group to come inside. The house was much like many others that Truman had seen during his time in Erion. The building was a cabin with typical wooden walls, wooden floor, and a very well-made wooden ceiling. The fireplace stood on one side of the room, a fiery blaze burning within the stone structure. In front of them was a large table with a bowl of fruit placed in the center. Behind that, there was a darkly colored door, presumably leading to a bedroom. As Truman thought this, the door opened and a man stepped out. "Well, I thought that was you," the man said, addressing the commander. "Good to see you, Burnley," Dunningham responded, smiling before crossing the room and shaking the man's hand. "To the rest of you, this is Burnley Woodington. He is our contact for our mission." Burnley was an older man with gray hair that was scattered in all directions. He wore a faded tan shirt, denim pants almost like jeans, Truman thought, and a pair of dark brown work boots. The group exchanged greetings with their newfound ally, after which Burnley smiled, noticing the hungry looks in their eyes. "Y'all must be starving. I'll try to whip something up for you." Before long, they were all sitting at the table feasting on a warm soup which Burnley had prepared. Dunningham let the others eat while he informed Burnley of their plans. After the meal, the group separated, resting before the next leg of their travels. Truman sat back in a chair which had been brought out after the meal. He noticed Tara sitting by the fire. She had a faraway look in her eyes. Truman felt his jewel heat up at his side. Confused, he quickly pulled it out. Its normally blue-green tint had turned into a bright yellow. Truman looked at Tara in wonder. What did this mean, he thought, before going over to her. "Hey, how are you doing with all this?" Truman asked. "Fine," she said, not meeting his gaze. Truman didn't know whether to tell her how they'd come to Erion, although his jewel appeared to be wanting him to do something. The two of them sat quietly, looking at the fire. "Actually, I'm worried about my dad," Tara said, breaking the silence. Truman smiled sadly. "I'm worried about my mom too," he responded. "Lord Vernon won't be kind to them. But if there's anyone who can take care of themselves, it's Kelgore." Tara nodded, smiling at the memory of her father. "That's why this mission is so important," Truman continued. "It's for them." "Why did your mom stay behind?" Tara asked. "To draw the attention away from us and keep the people on the main island encouraged." "You're right," Tara said. "We must do this for them and for their sacrifice." "All right," Commander Dunningham said, breaking into their conversation. "Time to go." Chapter 7. Before long, Jerome entered the mining compound. After he had sighted the smoke, it wasn't long before signs lined the path, directing him toward the camps. A large bonfire stood in the middle of the encampment, illuminating the entire area around it with its warm glow. Jerome crossed to the fire, warming his hands after the cold journey. As he stood there, Jerome took in his surroundings. On one side of the compound stood a large wooden building, much larger than any cabin Jerome had ever seen. A sign was nailed above the door that read, "Administration Office." Below this was written in smaller lettering, "Willie Tanson, Foreman." Jerome crossed to the building and went up its wooden steps, entering the door. Inside, two rockers stood next to a large stone fireplace, heat emanating from the blaze inside it. "What can I do for you, mister?" a man called from what appeared to be the front desk. Jerome walked over to the desk, the wooden floor creaking beneath him as he did so. "It's pretty empty out there," Jerome said. "Y'all look like you could use some help. The name's Melvin Newport, and I heard you were looking for a good miner. I'll work hard, and frankly, I could use the job," Jerome continued, playing the part as best he could. "We are missing one man," the desk clerk replied, looking over a ledger he had in front of him. The man wore a red and green plaid shirt with denim pants, the dust of hard work plain to see. "Our foreman is holding a big contest to decide who's going to take his place." "Well, how do you enter?" Jerome asked, addressing the man.
Right here, the clerk responded, sliding a form across the table to him. The form itself was brightly decorated. Willie Tanson Mining & Co. Do you have what it takes to be a Tanson miner? Was written in great grandeur across the top of the document. Below that, there were spaces to put your name. Only, were there spaces? Jerome wondered as he scanned over the sign-up sheet. Countless names were written. It was going to be a tough fight ahead. However, at the bottom, there was a final space. Do you have a pen? Jerome asked, breathing a silent sigh of relief. The clerk handed him a quill, freshly dipped in black ink. Taking the pen, Jerome wrote the name Melvin Newport. When does this start? Jerome asked. You're just in time. The competition starts in 2 days. Everyone is down at the mines practicing their skills, you see. The man we lost was Tanson's second in command, so even people who work here could stand to get the promotion. Where could I get some tools? Jerome asked the man. Right back here, the clerk replied, gesturing toward the wall on the far side of the room. Pickaxes were hung on hooks on the wall, while boxes of explosives were recessed into storage areas carved out of the wooden surface. Do we need any harnesses or anything like that? Ordinarily, yes, but Tanson is looking for a miner with true courage and grit. So for the contest, there will be no harnesses. Well, that puts a whole new meaning on May the Best Man Win, Jerome thought. It's more like May the Best Man Live. Tanson will want to meet you, stranger. He'll want to interview everybody before the big show. Fine with me, Jerome replied, fighting to keep the nervous tone out of his voice. Where do we sleep? He asked. We have rooms available. The sleeping quarters are across camp. You'll find a trail branching off from the main road. If you follow it, you will find a collection of cabins. They're not the most comfortable, but they're the best we could manage. I gotcha. With that, the man handed him a key, room 802. That's the key. Your room is in building 8. Following this, Jerome left, heading down the dirt road. After walking a little ways, he came to the trail the clerk had indicated. The path was also made of dirt, weaving its way through the tangle of vegetation around it. Jerome pushed his way through the greenery, attempting to bar his path, and continued on. He found the situation as the clerk had described. Large wooden cabins were situated side by side. This gave the impression of a forest getaway. Building 6, Building 7, there we go. Building 8, Jerome muttered, reading the numbers above the cabin doors. He walked to his cabin. It was very well made. 2 large support beams stood bearing the weight of the large overhanging canopy that provided shade for those on the porch. Jerome walked up to the cabin steps and put his key in the door. Inside was a long hallway with rooms on either side of him. They could have told me about this, Jerome muttered. He walked down the hall, the wooden floor creaking under his weight. Jerome could just make out room numbers by the dim light cast from the oil lamps that were set on either side of the room. Jerome kept walking until he reached room 802. Opening it, he went in. The room was small. The walls were painted white with a cot sitting off to the right side of the room. That was pretty much it. Jerome sighed, laying down on the small cot and rested from the long day. Chapter 8. Before leaving, Commander Dunningham brought them all over to the dining table. He had spread out a large scroll of parchment. The scroll appeared to be completely blank. The group looked at each other, the confusion evident on all their faces. Dunningham beckoned to Burnley, who handed him a cup with a clear liquid inside. Now everybody be ready to learn these quick. The ink will fade fast, the commander ordered, pouring the contents of the cup onto the parchment. Instantly, the scroll depicted a list of names written in thick black lettering. Next to each name was a description of where they lived. The whole group, Burnley included, focused their attention on the list. The ink was already beginning to fade, as Dunningham had warned. A few minutes later, the ink was gone entirely, leaving nothing but the blank sheet of parchment behind. Everyone got it? Dunningham asked. Between us all, I think we do, John Maxwell said, looking to Truman for confirmation. He nodded his agreement. With that, the group, with the exception of Burnley, set out. As Mr. Maxwell had predicted, they were able to remember the names between them all. From ally to ally, they traveled, spreading hope's ember wherever they went. Dunningham had been correct. Many people had been saddened and simply needed a reason to hope again. They finally came up to the last home on the list, staying in the shadows as they had done many times before. There was a feeling of hesitant joy among the party. Dunningham walked up to the cabin first. It had large trees on either side, almost forming a natural canopy over the small house. A young woman answered, speaking to Dunningham for a moment before calling over her shoulder. An older man came to the door, gesturing for Dunningham to come inside. In response, Dunningham pointed toward their group. The man nodded and signaled for them to come as well. The group filed out from the shadows, walking up to the quaint cabin. "Welcome," the man said. "I've always hoped this day would come. Dunningham tells me that it's time to bring back the old kingdom. My name's Milton Wells." He sat them down at a table where Dunningham began to tell the story of their planned attack on Tansen and how a small band of allies had landed on their island. At this, Truman told the story of their mysterious arrival to Erion, also telling of his visions and of the suffering that he knew Lord Vernon had caused. Before he knew it, Truman had pulled out his jewel, holding it before him for all to see. "The jewel is the reason I'm here. It's the reason we came on this mission. Erion itself seems to know that if we do not unite, we will fall forever. The jewel is a sign of Erion's urgent call to arms." The room became silent, every eye looking at Truman in wonder. "Where did you get that?" Dunningham asked, speaking for everyone. Truman told the miraculous story of the jewel washing up on the shore and the message it had left. After this, Mr. Wells stood, saluting Dunningham, Truman, and the rest of the group. "You have my support," Wells vowed. Dunningham nodded to the rest of the group. "You can go now," he said. "We need to get back to the base before we're discovered." "I'll be with you in a minute," Dunningham said, speaking to their company. The rest of them filed out, leaving the commander to fill Wells in on some final details of their operation. After leaving the cabin, Tara came over to Truman. The two of them walked around to the back of the house. In front of them, there was a small creek leading into a cave. "When you brought out that jewel, I felt something in me," Tara said, breaking the silence. Truman nodded, looking into the creek before speaking. "I have a feeling," his voice trailed off. "What sort of feeling?" she asked. "Shh," Truman said, putting a finger over his mouth to signal. He could feel it again. The jewel was calling him to do something. They crept closer to the mouth of the cave. "What?" Tara replied, mouthing a silent question. "Not quite sure yet," Truman responded, pulling out his jewel. It seemed to be glowing brighter as they moved closer to the cave. All at once, a small orb of golden light burst out of the darkness, bathing the little brook in its glow. Truman smiled, knowing the feelings Tara must be having as she picked up the small jewel. "I don't understand," she said, looking at Truman, the shock plain in her bright yellow eyes. Truman noticed that they had grown more brilliant since the jewel's appearance, as if they were somehow now complete. "Erion has chosen you," he responded. "I felt the same way when I found my jewel. I think each of us plays an important part in bringing down Lord Vernon. The jewels must have a connection to each other." Following this statement, the two companions continued talking for quite some time, enjoying their newfound connection. Chapter 9. As soon as Dunningham left with the rest of his party, Burnley set out. He had to let Tansen know what was going on. Once Dunningham got his allies together, their control of the island could be compromised, and there might be hope of restoring the old kingdom. Calderonia wouldn't be able to rule itself anymore, Burnley thought in horror. Bang, bang, bang. Jerome woke to the sound of pounding at his door. He rubbed his eyes before getting to his feet and answering the persistent knocking. A man glared at him after Jerome opened the door. "Well, come on in," Jerome responded, trying not to sound too annoyed at being woken up from his nap. "I hear you're our final contestant. I'm the foreman here, Willie Tansen," he said, scratching his chin as he spoke. "You sure you're up for the challenge?" he asked. "I've done hard jobs before. I can do another one," Jerome replied evenly. Tansen smiled. I do like a man with confidence. We could use more people like you. It's gonna be tough. Only the best men can get into tents and mining. The clerk told me he gave you a sneak peek at the rules of the contest. You mean no harnesses? Jerome asked. Yeah, that stuff. Anyway, he said you played it pretty cool. Jerome grinned in response. I like a good challenge, so it sounds like I came to the right place. Tansen pulled out a map and began pointing out different locations. This is where the bulk of the iron that we mine is kept. We have some smiths that work for us to turn the raw stone into things that we can use. I have a good feeling about you, so I'm trusting you to keep these things a secret. Other camps might hijack our resources, and we'd be out of business. Jerome nodded seriously. This was just too easy, he thought. Now over here, this is our equipment overflow storage, Tansen continued, gesturing to another area of the map. Don't worry, we keep it nice and secure. I see, Jerome said. What do you use all those extra tools for? Tansen fixed Jerome with a long look before speaking, apparently gauging how much he should share with the newcomer. Well, Tansen said, putting his thumbs through the belt loops of the faded work pants he was wearing, let's just say they sell for a good price. I have some friends in high places. Tansen appeared to be about to continue when a man burst into the room. He had a large mop of gray hair that looked like it had been through a whirlwind. Aside from that, his attire was similar to the rest of the miners. Denim pants, faded shirt, and boots. Burnley, what are you doing? Can't you see I'm busy? The big show's tomorrow, Tansen exclaimed upon the other man's entry. I'm sorry, Willie, but I have to talk to you. What about? It's that Dunningham. I have a feeling they're going to try it. Tansen turned to Jerome. You're into the contest. What's your name again? Melvin Newport, Jerome responded, fighting to keep his expression neutral, in case this was a test. With that, he left the room so as not to arouse suspicion. Once outside the room, Jerome put his ear to the door to listen. What makes you think that they're going to try it? Came the muffled sound of Tansen's voice. Well, you see, Dunningham and a group of about 4 others came to my house to discuss plans for a raid on this camp. They had a list of people who Dunningham believes will join their side. I think our camp is just the beginning. It seems like they are planning to overthrow Lord Vernon. If they win, I am worried we'll lose control of the islands and things will go back to how they were under King Xavier. So Dunningham has been at it all this time, Tansen said thoughtfully. Send Bigsby over to the main island and see if we can't get some reinforcements. We're not going down that easy, Dunningham, Tansen said to himself. Jerome's heart began to race. He hadn't even needed to stay for the competition. The time was now, and Dunningham must be warned. Without a second thought, Jerome took off toward the doorway of the cabin. He heard the door behind him open as he ran. Hey! Jerome heard Tansen exclaim. Get him! He's hurt us! Jerome slammed his shoulder into the door at the front of the cabin, forcing it open. The pounding of footsteps could be heard close behind him. Making it outside, Jerome ran to the shrubbery searching for the path that led back to the main compound. Jerome plunged into the thick tangle of shrubbery surrounding the small cluster of cabins. Oh, I so wasn't made for this, Jerome said, as a particularly large branch struck him as he ran. However, adrenaline carried him on. He could hear his pursuers shouting for assistance as they followed. Finally, Jerome burst out of the tangle of branches that had been closing in around him. He could hear Tansen and Burnley not far behind. Jerome sprinted as fast as he could toward the exit of the camp and the mountains beyond. Chapter 10. Truman and Tara were just beginning to leave the cave when they heard footsteps coming fast from the mountains above. Both of them ducked back into the cave and waited. Closer, closer, closer. Truman crept silently forward, unconsciously putting his hand on the hilt of his sword. Before long, the form of a man came into view, his back facing them. Moving swiftly, Truman advanced toward the man, drawing his sword as he came. Tara prepared an arrow covering him from behind. In a flash, Truman had the man in an iron grip, placing the cold edge of his blade against his neck. Whoa, whoa, whoa! I'm just traveling through, Jerome said. The name's Melvin Newport. Truman's eyes widened and he released his grip on his friend's neck. "How'd you make it out, Jerome? I could barely recognize you with that jacket on." "Yeah, I prefer my overalls," Jerome said good-naturedly. "But there's no time for that," he continued, his expression growing serious. "Where's Dunningham?" "Right here, Jerome," Dunningham said, coming around the corner to join the group. "Listen, you still want to attack the Tansen mining camps, right?" Jerome asked. His eyes were the kind of intense that made anyone pay attention. "Yes," Dunningham said, his expression intensifying as the possibility of battle became more evident. "Now is the time to do it," Jerome responded. "Some guy named Burnley busted in while Tansen and I were discussing the competition. He knows about our plan for the raid." At this, Jerome paused and smiled before continuing. "I got much more than that. Tansen gave me a whole scoop, layout and everything." Dunningham waited patiently as Jerome went into the tale of his heroic escape from the mining camp. "That Burnley, what does he look like?" Dunningham asked. "You know, denim pants, tan shirt. He looked like a hard-working fella. It's too bad he had to be on the wrong side," Jerome responded. "Yes, it's definitely too bad, Jerome. It definitely is," Dunningham replied, looking off into the distance. Truman broke in. "What should we do?" "Well, Tansen said he was going to send one of his men over to get reinforcements from Lord Vernon." "What?" Truman gasped. "That could change everything. If they get reinforcements over here, our mission will be compromised." Jerome looked at the boy with a calm and collected expression. "That, my friend, is why we attack now." Tara nodded in agreement. "After all, half of this mission has already been completed," she said, reminding him of the finding of her jewel. "Well, sounds like we have a lot to discuss," Dunningham said, speaking to Jerome. With that, the group headed back into Mr. Wells' home to fill him in. Afterwards, the whole company, including Wells, headed back to their base to prepare for the battle ahead. Chapter 11. It was much like those stories that Truman had read at home, where the good guys were in hiding, outnumbered, and undersupplied. Only this time, a happy ending was anything but guaranteed. Truman thought all this as he sharpened his sword and prepared for battle. "All right, guys, let's move," came the sound of Otto Winsworth's voice. "Let's go, go, go," he continued, hustling the other men along. Truman put his sword back into the dark black sheath that hung at his side, and then joined the others in the main room. Jerome was drawing out what he remembered from his time in the mining compound. "Tansen said this is where they keep the extra mining supplies." The Orf gave a little wink as he said this last part. "I think that the storage areas are actually where they are keeping weapons that they could sell to the highest bidder." "I see," Dunningham commented, his brow furrowed in thought. "Come to think of it, they did hold back some of the weapons that we requested. It started a little at a time, but before long, we stopped receiving any orders at all." "Yes, the point is now that I've been found out as a spy, they will likely attempt to move the weapons so that my information would be obsolete. If we catch them while they're moving things around, our mission would be easier than we could have ever hoped." "Agreed," Dunningham said. "Stantonbury, Winsworth, get your units together. We're going in." Bigsby Whittendale crept towards the edge of the beach until he heard a noise above him. He looked up to see two lookouts staring back at him. Then, one of them drew an arrow and released it. He ran, diving into the water. The archer's arrow thudded in the sand where he had just been. Bigsby's face went pale as he began swimming toward the main island with all his might. After many long minutes of hard swimming, Bigsby reached the shore, his shoes making swishing sounds from the water they'd taken in. He was met by two stern-looking knights in black staring down at him. "I need to speak to Lord Vernon," Bigsby said, choking on salt water as he spoke. Chapter 12. Truman crept silently alongside his comrades as darkness began to fall. The Guardians of the Whirlpool had separated into 3 squadrons. One was commanded by General Stantonbury, another commanded by Winsworth, and the last one led by none other than Commander Dunningham. Jerome took the lead as the terrain gave way to rocky mountains. Each squadron was complete with a group of swordsmen out front that would head directly into combat, while a small group of archers would cover them from behind. This design, though used many times, always seemed to bring good results in Dunningham's experience, or so he said. Truman absent-mindedly put his hand on the hilt of his sword as the tension of the moment began to rise in him. Jerome put a finger up in the air to signal the company to stop. The war party obeyed, peering through the darkness. "See right up there?" Jerome whispered. "That's where their camp is." "All right, men, on me," Dunningham said, signaling for the other 2 units to take the sides of the camp while his group began the initial assault. Truman drew his sword, following Dunningham. He couldn't help looking back to see if Tara was covering his back. He had a feeling that she was a good shot. The 2 of them made eye contact for a moment before nodding and moving toward the battle ahead. The other 2 groups circled around the camp as Dunningham had indicated. Truman's heart raced as the promise of battle edged steadily closer, closer, closer. "For Erion!" All of a sudden, Dunningham's voice rang out, and their group charged, bursting into the mining camp at full speed. They were met by a company of Lord Vernon's knights. However, the sheer will of the front line carried them through with little difficulty. Truman slammed his shield into one of the knights in the front of the camp, sending him careening into the air. Moments later, miners and evil knights alike poured out of the different buildings surrounding the compound in an ambush. Dunningham gave a shout, ordering their archers to unleash a volley of arrows into the fray. They did so, causing many an enemy to fall. Truman was suddenly met by a black-clad knight. The knight swung a heavy axe in his direction. Truman ducked the blow, while thrusting his sword out in a simple stabbing motion. The knight blocked it with his shield, leaving Truman's blade embedded in its thick wood. Truman tried to yank it free to no avail. Seizing his advantage, the knight lifted up his axe, preparing for a finishing blow. An arrow whizzed over Truman's head, striking the neck of the knight mid-stroke. The knight crumpled to the ground at Truman's feet. Truman looked over his shoulder to see Tara advancing, firing arrow after arrow. Seeing this, Truman charged forward as well, and the 2 of them carved their way deeper into the camp. They could hear sounds toward the rear of the compound now, and knew the other squadrons must be engaging the enemy as well. The group pressed forward, encouraged by the closeness of success. Reaching the end of the main encampment, Truman followed the sounds of battle, Tara close behind. They reached a large wooden building that was reinforced with heavy metal locks, barring the entry. It was here that the most important conflict was taking place. Both Stantonbury and Winsworth's units were pressing forward on a large force of guards surrounding the structure. Based on the sheer amount of forces focused on this single building, this must be the location of the weapons stockpile, Truman thought. The guards surrounding the building suddenly pressed forward, forcing the Erionian soldiers back. Tara drew an arrow and fired at one of the knights at the rear of the conflict, who seemed to be giving orders. The arrow struck the man in the side of the neck, causing him to collapse to the ground. Without a leader, the guards were thrown into a state of confusion. Sensing this, both Erion units forced their way forward. Truman charged ahead, joining in the siege. Lowering his shield, he plowed through the enemy ranks. Tara's arrows followed him overhead. The miners and knights surrounding the structure fought valiantly. However, both units closed in around them ever so slowly, determined to take back what was theirs. Commander Dunningham's forces were now fighting their way in their direction as well. The tide of battle had turned in their favor. "Surrender now, and you will not be harmed," Dunningham called out. At this, Tansen came out from among the enemies, looking tired and subdued. Then, an arrow whizzed through the air, embedding itself in Dunningham's chest. Dunningham went pale as he looked from Tansen's smirking face to the pool of blood now forming beneath him. Truman made eye contact with Tara, her face twisted in shock and rage. The 2 of them nodded, the power of their jewels telling them what they must do. Truman charged to his commander's aid, sinking his blade deep into Tansen's midriff just seconds before the small man would have finished the commander off. Tansen looked at the boy in shock before collapsing to the ground lifeless.
Truman rushed over to Dunningham, who was still clinging to life as his comrades charged the enemy, and raged at their leader's betrayal. Blood was pouring out of Dunningham's wound now. Truman frantically ripped his sleeves, forming a makeshift bandage for the commander. Truman could hear the door of the weapon depot being forced open as he worked. Dunningham looked him squarely in the eye. "Thank you, son, but this is more than just about me. The journey must go on. I'll be okay," Dunningham said, his voice coming out in weak rasps. "Need to get some help over here," Truman called desperately. He'd grown to admire this man. Tara rushed over as the shouts began to ring out. "Anything I can do?" she asked. "We need some people to carry him. I got the blood to slow down a little bit," Truman exclaimed. In a moment, 2 large soldiers ran over, picking up their leader and carrying him into Tanson's former office at the front of the camp. Here, they sat him down on some blankets which Tara laid out for him. "We won, sir," one of the soldiers said, smiling at the commander, while another soldier pulled the arrow out of the wounded man's chest. Then he quickly replaced Truman's makeshift bandage. "You're going to be all right, sir. Just stay strong," the man said, clasping the commander's hand in his own. The commander turned to look at Truman. "It looks as if you saved my life," he said weakly. "I am very grateful to you." "You just rest," Truman said. "Erion needs you." Leaving the commander to heal from his wounds, Truman stepped outside. The guardians of the whirlpool were hard at work, some men transporting the arms that they seized in battle, while others guarded those of the enemy that were left. Tara walked up beside him. "I guess this means you'll be moving on soon," she said. "I suppose it does," Truman responded, looking back at Tara. "Lord Vernon knows where we are now. We pose a threat to his power. That's a danger to all of us, which is why we have to move fast." "Where will you go next?" Tara asked. "I think the island that's the closest. That would be Regoria," Truman responded. "I see," Tara responded, a slight tone of sadness in her voice. "Thank you for everything you've done," Tara continued. "What will you do now?" Truman asked. "From what you tell me, there will be a lot to do to prepare in order to take down Lord Vernon. I will do my best to do what I can here." "Ow!" Tara said, pulling out her jewel. "This thing is hot!" she exclaimed. "Does yours do that?" "Yes. My jewel did it just now, too. Something tells me that we will meet again, so don't worry," Truman said, voicing the thoughts that had been troubling them both. Jerome walked up to them, his boots crunching on the loose rocks beneath his feet. "Is Dunningham in there?" he asked, pointing toward the doorway behind them. "Yes, he's being treated right now." "I'll just go check on him." With that, the Orf went inside, closing the door behind him. A few minutes later, he returned. "Where's your father?" he asked Truman. "Dunningham thinks we should head out." "He's somewhere around," Truman responded with a shrug. "I'll go find him," Jerome said, heading off in search of Mr. Maxwell. "Well, I guess this is goodbye for now," Truman said. He couldn't help feeling the same sadness that he knew Tara had felt earlier. "I suppose it is," Tara responded. Jerome came up with Mr. Maxwell close behind. "Ready to go?" Truman's dad asked his son. "Yep," Truman said, turning to Tara. "Remember what I said earlier. Don't worry. We will meet again." Tara nodded at her friend. "I'm going to hold you to that," she said, smiling. Then Truman, his dad, and Jerome headed out of the compound. Just before the camp was out of view, Truman turned, lifting his jewel high into the air. In the distance, he could see Tara lift hers up. Both of the jewel's natural glows redoubled in a flash of brilliant light. After that, Truman heard Tara's voice in his head. "May the power of the whirlpool go with you," it said. Truman turned and resumed his trek down the mountainside. We hope you have enjoyed Hope's Ember, Book 2 of the Erion Scrolls, written by Tucker Waters, read to you by Philip Pomeroy.